Now we're going to bring on Mr. Farhan Lalji. He is a Vancouver correspondent and senior football reporter for SportsCenter, TSN's flagship sports news and information program. Lalji, who joined TSN in 1997, covers the Canucks and the BC Lions, as well as other sports stories in the Vancouver area. He also covers football, NFL, CFL, college football across North America, and is a CFL insider. In addition to his television work with TSN, Lalji is also a regular contributor on TSN 1040 radio and a fill-in sports anchor at CTV Vancouver. Welcoming you in, Farhan. How are you doing tonight, man? Appreciate you coming on with us tonight.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm sorry I couldn't dress the part, though. You guys have taken it to another level.
Hey, it's Mavs Sports Take first Halloween edition. So we wanted to make it special and memorable for all of our listeners and anybody who joins us watching this live take.
Well, you know what? Maybe before it's all over, I can slip on a mask or something. Does this count? If I just do that, does that count? Probably not.
No, probably not. And you know what? Years past, maybe, but in 2020, that's just going with the flow now.
That's the normal now. So
yeah, that's the new normal. I really appreciate you coming on. Obviously, our connection from the CFL and everything, and then what's going on up there. I think our listeners really don't know what's happening, and it's something that should be talked about. First and foremost, though, I think we need to pay respects. Troubling news out of BC yesterday, with the passing of the the longest tenured owner in the CFL, David Braley. As a man who lives in the community and covers CFL, especially the Lions, you'll know best, if not better than anybody, what he's meant to the franchise, the league, and the community. Can you just speak on that to our listeners to give him some time here?
Yeah, I mean, David Braley has just been a real icon in the Canadian Football League. He took over the BC Lions late in the 96 season when the team was basically in receivership from their previous owner. So, he rescued the franchise on so many levels and just brought a real level of stability to it because, excuse me, he's very successful in steel and in the auto parts industry. He's based out in Hamilton, and he's actually owned 3 teams in the CFL at various times, including 2 at once, which at the time was an 8-team league. And that's a lot of power when you own 2 teams. But, he's certainly done a lot of great things here with the BC Lions. He's been very committed. I mean, the league kind of goes through ebbs and flows depending on the franchise. Some teams are quite profitable. Some teams, you better have a philanthropist. And David's had both of those here in BC, both of those elsewhere in the league. He's given millions in his community in Hamilton to his alma mater at McMaster University in Hamilton. He's got the Order of Canada. Just a person that's been really, really well respected across the country, and his passing got a lot of mention from people, in all platforms, not just football. So a sad day in the NFL, or in the CFL. He'd been in bad health for some time. So, I think none of us were necessarily surprised that it happened, but a hard day nonetheless.
Well, it's hard also because I mean Ed Hervey retired or left the team just 10 days ago, and now the owner passes. That's a lot of transition for the club to be going through. How are they going to handle this transition moving forward? Have they given you any indication how this is going to go?
Well, I mean, first of all, they're going to wait. Obviously, I mean, there's going to be a funeral and a service at some point, in a week or so, and then about a week after that, I would imagine that they're going to open up the will. And I know that Braley did have some specific instructions with how he wanted the Lions dealt with, right? So first question, as far as the executor and the estates and the family, do they want to continue to own the team? Which I would be surprised if long-term that's what they wanted. I think more than anything, David wanted stability for the team during a transition, and he put a number of mechanisms in place, both in terms of finances and legally, to ensure that happens. There are a group of local businessmen who have tried to buy the team from David for some time, and he just didn't want to sell it. He didn't like the structure of the ownership group. Deep down, I think those close to David and close to the team knew that David didn't really want to sell it, and I don't know that there would have been a plausible CFL offer that he would have accepted. I mean, if someone blew him out of the water with, an NFL type offer, then obviously, but that's not realistic. So I think anything that would have fit the CFL profile wasn't going to be enough for David because the league meant so much to him. He just didn't want to relinquish influence. He always wanted to have a seat at the table. But now that he's passed, I can't see his family or his estate wanting to run the team long term. So, I would imagine that in the next year or so, there will be a transition to a group of local businessmen. And then the question becomes, is there an actual asking price? Because as I mentioned, when David bought the team, he took it out of receivership. And that happened with Montreal earlier this year, where the team didn't get sold essentially for a dollar amount. They basically picked up the debt, right? And that was the owner's cost for taking over the team. And, that's happened in the league before. So, the team in the last few years hasn't been as successful at the gate. So it hasn't been as profitable as teams like Edmonton, who you worked for, or Saskatchewan or Winnipeg. So, I would imagine that it winds up being, a transfer of assets as opposed to a formal sale with an 8-figure amount attached to it.
That's interesting, because I would have thought that there would be a sale price. That's
There might be, but it won't
Yeah.
be what David was looking for, 3 or 4 years ago when, when he was talking about the team kind of being at the height of sale at that point. So it's been a story here for a long time, 6 or 7 years at least, that David has talked about selling the team, and ultimately it just hasn't happened, which is, as I mentioned, led everyone here to believe he just never really wanted to sell it.
What you kind of get, he's been in the league for how many years? I mean, he was the longest tenured owner. It's kind of like when Mr. Davis was getting on in years, he didn't want to give up his seat either. So, kind of get it.
Yeah, and David had a lot of influence. As I mentioned, at one point he owned 2 teams, but even when he just owned one, his opinion was large. I mean, if you think about Jerry Jones or Robert Kraft, that's a 32-team league. David had that level of voice in a 9-team league. So, he certainly had his power. Some people viewed him as a bully or a tyrant in terms of how he wielded that power. And if you were a commissioner in this league, you needed to make sure David Braley was on side. Now, in the last year, with his health the way it has been, even though he's been an owner, he hasn't really had the voice. But, nonetheless, that was certainly a part of who he was and how he operated, and it mattered to him.
Farhan, I want to take us to a wide scope CFL perspective, because obviously we have seen different sports leagues have their successes, have the trials and tribulations with trying to get through such a difficult time. From a CFL perspective, the foreseeable future, back in 2021, are we working in a bubble? What do you think is the best optimal outcome for the CFL? And what do you think is probably the more realistic CFL version that we might see soon?
Well, truthfully, I think by the time the dust settles, and this is just the optimistic me, not necessarily, providing an insider's perspective here. I do think that by the time we get to next June, when the league is supposed to start, that we will be in a place where we could at least get limited attendance in stadiums, right? So I do see a scenario where teams are operating at home, that a full schedule is being played. You might see 5,000 fans a game, based on limited attendance. I could see that happening, but I do know that the league is also looking at the bubble model. Now, last year they had put one in place that it was basically going to last 3 months, and that includes training camp all the way through championship. So I do know that that's kind of their nuclear option, right? Where no fans in the stands and they play in a bubble. They went through this exercise last year. They'd settled on Winnipeg as the city. 6 or 7 of the teams wanted to do it. They were looking at getting government funding, and everybody would have done it with government funding. Without the government funding, there were still 6 or 7 teams that wanted to do it, but ultimately not enough to make it go. So I think that's the question that needs to be answered in the next month. They're going to go through a long-term business plan as well as short-term options, and they're going to present that to all the owners and governors by what would have been the Grey Cup, which is the last week of November. So I think they want to get certainty that if we have the nuclear option again and there's no government assistance again, are you willing to play? And I do think they're going to find a way to make that happen. And I also think government assistance will be there. Last time around, there were some political reasons why it didn't happen. But the government at that time said they still did want to work with the league. They just wanted to get a little more clarity and not necessarily be so rushed in terms of how it went down. And they were dealing with some of their own controversy at that time as well, that this might not have just sat as well with the general public. But I think when we get to next spring and that time comes, I do think there's going to be some government funding available. And I wouldn't be surprised, like I said, if teams were able to play at home in a full schedule with limited attendance. At least that's what I'm hoping.
Would you think a bubble scenario like over there in Toronto and Hamilton would look good? Because you could have the Western teams play in one home stadium and the Easterns, and they're only about a half hour apart. driving wise.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible, and it was an idea that was explored last year, but I think they felt the infrastructure required to create the bubble, you only want to do in one spot, right? Because, there's so much cost attached to that when you look at testing and the other things that need to get done. Now, again, this is where this becomes such a challenge because we just don't know what this is all going to look like in the spring from a financial perspective, from a virus perspective, a fan's perspective. They could turn around and say, okay, it's wide open. We've got a vaccine, and the government says, the Canadian government, David, is a lot more cautious than the American government. So It's not just, but let's say the best case happens and the federal government says, yep, quarantines are all lifted. We've got a vaccine. We're good. The fans may not jump right back in with both feet immediately. The CFL's demo generally skews older. So that's more of an at-risk population compared to the rest of society. So, they may not all jump back right away, right? So the revenue isn't all going to be there. So when you talk about a bubble, I think the main reason to do a bubble is to keep costs down. And I think as a result, it probably makes the most sense to have a single bubble, which, I think they projected out that with 9 teams, they could logistically make it happen in Winnipeg. So, and I'm not saying they're sold on the city, but in terms of the concept, what the testing in the bubble itself would look like, what the requirements are, what the CBA will look like. I think they've gone through that entire exercise, and they would just take that and transplant it from 2020 to 2021.
That's interesting. And obviously we'll keep our eyes and ears on that because, a lot of players down here are interested in coming up and playing. And there's a lot of American players that make their money up in the north of the border, and they want to be able to get back to work up there. So I want to jump into some of these Halloween themed questions now for you. So the first one is, pick the scariest defense in the NFL.
Wow. Probably the Chicago Bears. Just watching them play last night, I think that's an exceptional team. They've got an inside-outside presence with Khalil Mack and Akeem Hicks. They're strong in the secondary. I think it's a complete defense, and I just look at how bad that offense is. I feel sorry for some of those guys on the defensive side of the ball because that is not a contending team. Because there used to be a myth, and actually I shouldn't say that. It wasn't a myth at one time that defense wins championships. In 2020, that's a myth. Offense wins championships. You need to be able to put points up on the board. If you look at Seattle, who has an awful defense and a great offense, I don't think either one of these teams are contenders. But if you gave me a choice, I'd take Seattle over Chicago right now.
It's interesting because I would take Pittsburgh, who's I think their defense, even though their offense is impressive, their defense is really something special.
Well, Pittsburgh's the most complete team because you throw in even how they punt the ball and what their special teams does. To me, that's the most complete team in the NFL. I like Kansas City. I still think they've got the highest potential because of who their quarterback is and just how much speed they have across the board. But in terms of complete team, I do like Pittsburgh. But as far as defense goes, you can make the case for Pittsburgh, and I think it's a pretty compelling case as well. But I'm going to lean Chicago.
Okay, now we do a lot of business on the football here on Mavs Sports Take. So this
just don't ask me fantasy stuff.
No, we don't do that here. Okay. That's not our show. We're all about business of sports here. So this next one's a business question. Which coach or GM should fear the Reaper cycle? Who's getting
what cycle?
The Reaper's cycle. Who's getting cut here? Who's getting
axed?
Who's getting axed?
Well, we've seen a couple already. I'm not sure the Ford family is going to be quite ready yet to cut loose from Matt Patricia. But when you look at what Detroit has done and just how they've managed to underachieve, I think that's a scary situation over there. I look across the NFC East and I just think there's too much newness in terms of Mike McCarthy and Ron Rivera. I don't see a scenario where Doug Peterson, just a couple of years removed from a Super Bowl title, is going to get gassed over there. So, I do tend to think those coaches are pretty stable. So, we've already seen the bloodletting that's happened in Atlanta. So I think right now I'm probably going to lean to Matt Patricia in Detroit.
See, I'm all over Adam Gase. I think Adam Gase needs to go. I think he's the cancer in the locker. He's the cancer in that Jets building. Like if you ask that question to me, my question, and Ryan, our listeners know, I have the clock on him. I think he needs to jump. He's the next one going.
Well, when you look at their offense, he was supposed to be an offensive guru, and offensively they're terrible. Sam Darnold has regressed even when he's healthy. The roster's flawed in so many spots. So, it probably does make some sense. The only reason I haven't gone there yet is because I almost thought it would have happened by now if it was going to.
I think they're waiting for the bye week. I think they're waiting for the bye week.
Could be.
Yep, that's usually a spot where things usually start to take place. I want to ask the next one here. Most Jekyll and Hyde team through the first half of the season. Which one is just all over the place for you?
Wow. Part of me wants to say New England, but they started hot and they're trending poorly, right? As opposed to just kind of being up and down. We saw a lot of up and down with Tampa Bay early on, but I think they've kind of righted it based on what's happened the last couple of years. Now, if you want to see the Jekyll and Hyde piece, I think Antonio Brown could bring that out there, right? I mean, I think he's a train wreck waiting to happen, and I'm not sure how that's going to play. I mean, it didn't work well for the short period of time he was with Brady in New England. Arians has got a little bit more of a longer leash with these guys, so could he lean in that direction? I mean, I think, I even looked at New Orleans, at one point in the season because their offense has been a little bit up and down, right? I mean, I just expected a little more from Drew Brees, but it's, they've managed to kind of dink and dunk and smoke and mirror it a little bit. I do think he's lost something there, but, generally in terms of win-loss record, there's been some consistency. So, probably New England is the most, just because we haven't seen that level of rock bottom. You kind of thought what you'd seen in the last couple of weeks, even though Newton wasn't playing as well, you thought they could tread water. But what happened in this last game, oh my God. That was just awful. And you wonder if that's just going to spiral in a bad way for a while here.
Yeah, and I think Jekyll and Hyde. It actually goes to a few teams in the league this year. That's why I was kind of curious about what you would say, because there are some teams that have been looking good, and then they're now starting to trend down, and there's some that didn't, and they're starting to come up. So
I was thinking the Raiders. I never know what the Raiders are going to do from a game-to-game perspective. Some weeks I'm like, they look like a legitimate contender, and then there's some goose eggs that get laid from time to time.
Well, I mean, and I think offensively, generally, they've been very good, but defensively, they're really, really unpredictable, right? And so I don't know how you can buy stock in the Raiders just because of that. I mean, they've got injuries defensively and they're just not that good. Throw in the COVID factor, with the offensive line this past game. And it's a tough one. I mean, I think John Gruden's unpredictable. I think Derek Carr's yet to show a complete level of consistency. I mean, I do like what they're doing offensively, but defensively, that's going to keep that group unpredictable all season.
Last one for you. Okay. Which team will rise from the grave for the second half of the season? With the Jets still being over, and I think there's still 10 teams with one win. Which is the team that's going to rise from that grave and just go on a tear here to finish the year out?
Okay, give me some choices here.
Okay, you're going to have, the Minnesota Vikings, the Houston Texans, the Jets, the Giants, the Washington Redskins, the Cincinnati Bengals.
Washington football team.
Oh, sorry.
Washington football team, David.
I'm a traditionalist, sorry.
You know what?
Jacksonville Jaguars.
I'm going to take the Houston Texans. I like Cincinnati and how Joe Burrow is trending, but I think that division is too tough. They're sitting there at 1-5-1, and everybody else has, I believe, at least 5 wins. So while I like what Burrow is doing, and I can still see him going to take out Andrew Luck's rookie passing record. I think there's a lot there with Deshaun Watson. I think JJ Watt and some pieces of that defense are very good. It's going to take them a couple of weeks to get used to Romeo Crennel and what he's doing, from a coaching standpoint and what changes they make to their systems. But I think they've got the right leadership. I think they've got the right roster. I am not a Kirk Cousins guy on any level. So you look at Minnesota, a lot of people are surprised they're where they are. I'm not surprised. So I'm going to take the Houston Texans of any of the teams to rise up out of the grave, given what their schedule looks like and what they have in that locker room.
Very cool.
David loves the Vikings, so you just broke his heart there.
Did I break your heart?
No, you didn't break my heart. I'm not a Cousins guy. I never have been. So the money.
I don't know how he got that kind of money guaranteed. That was crazy.
I know. That's what I'm saying. It's they just keep throwing money into that pot, which I'm not. I get there's not a lot out there when you go shopping for quarterbacks right now. There's just not a lot of not a lot of good ones out there. It shocked the hell out of me. The Colts didn't sign Bridgewater and they went with Rivers. I really thought Bridgewater was going to fit that system there and be their guy, and they let him go to the Carolina Panthers, which shocked the hell out of me.
When Stephon Diggs wanted out, in Minnesota, I think that tells you something. I love what Justin Jefferson's doing for them right now. I think he's a tremendously talented guy, but that kind of raised some alarm bells when they kind of had to make that situation go away, because he's definitely one of the top 7 or 8 receivers in the NFL. So they could certainly use him right now, but and it's unfortunate with what, to me, the bigger problem in Houston wasn't Bill O'Brien, the coach. It was Bill O'Brien, the de facto GM, right? And the way he kind of gutted that roster, letting DeAndre Hopkins go and taking on more salary to do it. The way he constructed that team was so flawed. I would have thought he would have learned something from Belichick, but clearly he hadn't. So
it's hard to be all encompassing. I mean, everybody wants to shop for the groceries as well as cook them, but what's much easier? Working with the shopper. Yeah. And letting them pick the groceries for you and go find the market ones for you, because they got more time to do it. And then that's just the way it is. Atlanta is one that I was waiting last year to blow up, and then they finally blew up this year. It'll be interesting to see what happens, who fills some holes there as far as GM head coach. But I think that could be a plum job for someone, because that owner is one that is patient. That owner is one that is shown that he will stick with his guys once he makes a pick. So.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And, they've got a decision to make with Matt Ryan, right? Like, what do they want to do there? Because as bad as it's looking right now, I mean, Ryan has been around for a while now. You could certainly make the case to move on from him at this stage, because you're going to fully rebuild, and they're in position to tank for Trevor, right? Or Justin Fields, right? And if you wind up in that scenario, you give me that choice, I would make that decision and go quarterback. I mean, if a team could move on from Peyton Manning, you can move on from Matt Ryan.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. That's not even a debate. Yeah. But thank you again for coming on tonight. We really appreciate you being here. What can we do to support you and what you do? Because you're already the big dog.
Listen, we got to get you back with a team. The only advice I'm going to give you is, when you do your next interview, don't wear the outfit.
Oh, come on. It's the Halloween show. You got to be dressed up. It's the Halloween. No,
I know it is. Much love, my friend. Thanks for having me, because you're great at what you do, and I'm always enjoying talking to you.
I appreciate it, Farhan, and your support means everything to me. Thank you so much, my friend.
All right, take care. Good meeting you, Ryan. We'll talk again.
You too, Farhan. Have a great one.